Our first speaker this afternoon is Luiz Sullivan de Oliveira, a recently minted PhD from Princeton University, where he's currently a postdoctoral lecturer. And he is working on turning, I'm assuming, your dissertation into a book that's really interesting called The Ascending Republic, Aeronautics, Culture, and Politics in France, 1860 to 1914. And he's also published a peer-reviewed article on this work, Imagining an Old City in 19th Century France, Urban Renovation, Civil Society, and the Making of Vieux-Lyon.
That's earlier work.
Earlier work. That is coming out, or is coming out in the Journal of Urban History. So join me in welcoming Patrick.
Thank you.
Since we're pressed by time, I'll get right to it. So, l'aéronautique est à l'ordre du jour. The aristocrat Henri de Laval wrote in a column for the conservative L'Écho de Paris on September 1st, 1901. As an aeronaut himself, Laval was certainly not a disinterested party, but it would have been hard to disagree with him. After all, during the 1900 Exposition Universelle, about 150 balloons departed from Paris. As Laval explained, le mouvement en faveur de la locomotion nouvelle est si puissant que nos grands polémistes, Henri Rochefort en tête, oublient par les moments leur idée fixe, la politique, consacrent eux-mêmes leur éditorial à l'aérostation. And at the center of this aeronautical movement stood a group that we now remember more for its conservatism than for its innovation, the aristocracy. In this paper, I will address the relationship between ballooning and aristocratic modernity, specifically how aeronautical pursuits became a fruitful avenue through which the aristocracy could perform a nationalist masculinity that both sought to distinguish itself from the rest of the population and present itself simultaneously as rallying to the service of the nation, especially in the realm of empire. That the late 19th century would become a golden age of ballooning was not obvious. After all, the technology made its debut in 1783, when the Montgolfier brothers made the first demonstration of an unmanned balloon flight in Annonay. Soon after, Paris, then France, then the rest of Europe, and the Atlantic world were enveloped by what contemporaries called a folie de ballon. Ascents in Paris drew as much as half of the city's population, with ballooning making its way into conversation, plays, illustrations, and more. The balloon also became a prevalent motif in clothing and furniture, thus embedding itself in the 18th century's burgeoning consumer culture. But this enthusiasm was short-lived. By the beginning of the 19th century, people had lost faith in the technology's usefulness. After all, every attempt to steer a balloon against the wind had failed. So the technology fell into the hands of marginalized acrobats who made spectacular ascents in post-revolutionary pleasure gardens. Crowds continued to gather to watch balloon ascents, but by the 1860s, the globes no longer inspired faith in the triumph of man over the winds or in progress. An 1862 lithograph by Maine, which depicts the use of balloons during the Second Empire festivals, can be read as conveying the morose state of aeronautics. Some art historians have read Manet's decision to align the balloon with the legless boy in the foreground. So the legless boy being the coup de jet, an urban type of the 19th century, right, of urban Paris. So the decision to align the balloon with the legless boy in the foreground as conveying his staunch republicanism, with the arrangement ironically commenting on the grim reality of warfare that the celebration of Napoleon III's imperial ambitions ignored. But if sociopolitically the juxtaposition of the balloon and the legless child lends itself to a relationship of contrast, technologically it may very well be read as one of analogy. The balloon, although surrounded by people, is no better than the ignored child, a crippled machine that never fully developed. But all of this changed with the Franco-Prussian War. The siege of Paris was a traumatic experience. Not only did Parisians suffer through the humiliating privations that had marked sieges since the age of castles, but the Prussians also managed to isolate Paris, the vie bavarde par excellence, from the rest of the world. Or, to be more accurate, the Prussian inundation almost managed to transform Paris into truly l'Île de France, as one contemporary put it. Led by the irascible Nadar, a group of Parisians quickly turned to balloons to communicate with the outside world. More than 60 took off during the 4-month siege, an average of 1 balloon every other day. They transported a variety of correspondence, letters, newspapers, official dispatches, and valuable human capital, like Léon Gambetta, and were deemed so important that the government cut gas to private residences so that it could be preserved to inflate the globes. And this was during an exceptionally cold winter. These flights were spectacles that reached far more people than the crowds who watched them depart from the top of Montmartre. For when floating through the sky, the balloons caught the eyes of Parisians all around the city. After the first balloon departure, a writer for Le Figaro described how, quote, "Many tender eyes follow this new kind of messenger. In every street of the capital, in every intersection, up and down the boulevards, curious masses pointed it out to the crowd." The author included his own reaction to the event, claiming that he felt a, quote, "sincere and profound emotion at the sight of the balloon." And here you have a contemporary painting soon after the siege ended, or the war ended, depicting Gambetta's departure in one of those balloons. And then you have this iconic painting by Puvis de Chavannes, which is, I think it's at the Musée d'Orsay, but at the time it was also made into lithographs, and it circulated around Paris during the siege itself. So, in short, the siege signaled a turning point, transforming the balloon into an emotive technology. And after the war, aeronautical pursuits acquired a new urgency. A new kind of geopolitical order started to be imagined, informed by the idea that if the British Royal Navy controlled the sea and the German Imperial Army the land, then France should take to the air. Thus, a flurry of aeronautical associations emerged, many of which focused on collecting data to aid the transnational effort of basically creating modern atmospheric science. As the years went by, the work of these associations bore fruit. In 1888, the Minister of Interior conducted a census on the state of ballooning in French society. In Paris, the survey came across 7 aeronautical societies, 65 civilian balloons, and almost 100 aeronauts, who together had made more than 4,500 ascents. So, where does the aristocracy come in all of this? After the positive experience with balloons during the siege of Paris, and with their use in the production of atmospheric science, the balloon was free to be appropriated by the higher echelons of French society. And in stepping into the limelight as the nation's most active aeronauts, aristocratic men signaled their class's relevance in a period typically assumed to mark the beginning of its decline. Fin de siècle France was still a world made up of very distinct identities, with many social traits still visible enough to distinguish between people from different regions. But in Paris, interpreting class signifiers was a vexing exercise, since the middle class found it increasingly easier to emulate the taste of elites thanks to the emergence of department store consumer culture and a democratization of urban entertainment. But this indeterminacy did not put an end to efforts in producing class distinctions. In fact, it served as a catalyst for such efforts, with the aristocracy searching for new ways to differentiate itself from the rest. Thorsten Veblen's insight in his 1899 Theory of the Leisure Class sheds light on this dynamic. He wrote, quote, "In order to gain and to hold the esteem of men, it is not sufficient merely to possess wealth or power. The wealth and power must be put in evidence, for esteem is awarded only on evidence." The French aristocracy put this axiom into practice by developing increasingly elaborate and expensive forms of leisure, which had emerged as a defined sphere of social practices in the second half of the 19th century. Sports became a prominent category under which leisure time was organized, and a burgeoning sporting culture bloomed in France, proving to be a fruitful venue to negotiate status anxieties. Aristocrats were enthralled with cultivating different sports, for it allowed them to practice distinction while also presenting themselves as working towards France's edification. In short, in Bourdieusian terms, sporting culture became one of the structuring structures of the aristocracy's habitus. From this context emerged people like Pierre de Coubertin, whose work would culminate in the reinvention of the Olympic Games. This politics of leisure and distinction started to transform ballooning as well. In 1898, members of Parisian high society interested in encouraging this new approach to ballooning came together to form the Aéroclub de France. It might seem paradoxical that elites would appropriate the balloon, an awkward means of transportation at best, in an era marked by its obsession with speed. After all, as various scholars have argued, the invention of speed in the 19th century also functioned as a crucible for social differentiation, since in the early modern period, rich and poor alike generally moved at a similar pace. But speed also went through a process of democratization. For instance, trains, initially a privilege of the wealthy, became more accessible, while a growing bicycle industry supplied workers with an efficient means to go to work during the week and the countryside during the weekend. As distances became shorter, more time was available for people to indulge in leisure, causing the rise of mass tourism. The balloon became an elitist retreat from the changes ushered forth by this transportation revolution. As one enthusiast explained, ballooning offered access to, quote, a corner of the world unknown to locomotives, safe from the insults of the pickaxe and the violations of the trowel. An aeronaut's practices were supposed to strike a healthy medium in which carefully cultivated skills, so endurance for long hours in a gondola, a good sense of wind currents, careful management of ballast, mitigated the risks that came with the quest for adventure. For example, it was written about the avid sportsman André Legrand that, quote, one might fear that his adventurous character sometimes pushes him toward the point of recklessness. But it is not so. Once inside the gondola, he becomes the calmest and most methodical of aeronauts, economical with his ballast and gas, not leaving anything to chance. Here, it is worth noting the crisis of masculinity that troubled Third Republic society, and which served as a general rubric to make sense of France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. In his new fin de siècle form, the aeronaut supposedly practiced an aristocratic manliness that countered France's decadence, a masculinity that was both virile and in control of itself, one that was shaped by the understanding that the combination of sports and adventure offered by ballooning promoted a refined and disciplined form of élan vital. A painting by Émile Friand evocatively depicts the infusion of brio into ballooning. Completed in 1899, Voyage à l'Infini features a man throwing out ballast as his balloon ascends past the canvas's upper edge. Friand resorted to symbolist tropes to represent nature, transforming the stormy clouds occupying the lower three-quarters of the canvas into nude women who erotically reach out in the balloon's direction. I don't know if you can see them outlined here. Aeronaut and nature engage in a relationship of ambiguous tension and dangerous seduction. One doesn't have to be a Freudian to infer the sexual connotation of the aeronaut pouring down his ballast over the sensual nudes. But the aeronaut's masculinity is also defined by stoic mastery over his virility, for he still maintains his composure by standing tall, his steadfast gaze directed toward the horizon. The ideal of an aeronaut's fin de siècle masculinity was also expressed in the Portrait d'aéronaute contemporain series that illustrated the cover of almost every issue of L'Aérophile, the main aeronautical publication of the time. Certain traits stood out amongst the men featured in the section. Descriptors that defined a modern aeronaut included un homme d'action, c'est gentleman rider de turf aérienne, gentleman rider in English, and a man of bonheur, entrain, and esprit chevaleresque. Although French ballooning culture was centered in Paris and deeply informed by its social cultural milieu, its performative aspects also extended their reach far beyond the capital. As other papers in this panel argue, border zones are central to the articulation of masculinity. One of these was the colonial space, which at the turn of the century was more so than ever considered as a ground for experiments with balloons. A representative of this phenomenon was Léo Dex, the pseudonym adopted by Édouard de Bureau, a lieutenant who researched ways to fly across the Sahara aboard a balloon. In the last decade of the 19th century, Dex published 6 studies on the subject. As he saw it, certain areas of the globe were too inhospitable and inaccessible for human exploration. Balloons offered a possible alternative, he argued, as long as one had a clear sense of the region's meteorological conditions. Dax found an eager partner to help him with his mission in Georges de Castillon de Saint-Victor, an aristocrat and one of the most celebrated aeronauts of the time. In late 1902 and early 1903, Dax and Saint-Victor went to Tunisia to see whether wind patterns would allow for flights across the Sahara. they released 2 unmanned balloons equipped with an elaborate system where water would serve as ballast and be periodically released to keep the balloon aloft throughout the journey. According to preliminary atmospheric observations, winter trade winds would drive the balloon southwest at speeds of 12 kilometers per hour. Dex and Saint-Victor decided that if one of the balloons reached either the outpost in Niger or, quote, the region between Tombouctou-la Mystérieuse and the Atlantic, it would signal the possibility of crossing the desert aboard a balloon. But the tests were a failure. The first balloon started making its way to Senegal, but the winds calmed down and it got stranded after traveling only 10 kilometers. The second balloon made it farther, although not in the desired direction. They're trying. After traveling 600 kilometers, the balloon was captured by Les Arabes in the southern provinces of Algiers. Since neither of the balloons succeeded, Dex and Saint-Victor planned to conduct more experiments in 1904, but Dex's premature death put an end to their efforts. Before his death, Dex published a series of mediocre colonial adventure novels in which balloons were portrayed as key technologies for the management of France's growing empire. The main character in these novels was, unimaginatively, Capitaine Dex, as in D'(EX), an adjutant major in the Saint-Cloud Aérostiers battalion. In one of the novels, an insurgent explodes in Madagascar, and Dex and his companions use a balloon to reach the island and bring things under control. In another one, Dex boards a balloon to come to the rescue of French troops that are surrounded by unfriendly indigènes in Chad. Dex's novels express the idea that as French possessions expanded, colonial administrators would have to develop new forms of territorial control, especially given the distance between French settlements and the lack of infrastructure in Africa. Thus, as the colonial imaginary started to solidify in the minds of Frenchmen in the late 19th century, they also started to see in the skies a way to make sense of and manage these vast territories. Dex's novels drew much of their content and structures from Verne's 5 Weeks in a Balloon, which was first published in 1863 and remained immensely popular, inspiring similar minor works. Rosalind Williams makes a compelling case that Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis that Americans were experiencing the closing of their frontier by the 1890s also applied to the European context. From the viewpoints of Europeans, Williams writes, lightly populated land was disappearing all around the globe, and these men became obsessed with discovering the last blank spaces left in their atlases. Verne, who at the time was Europe's most famous living writer, both reflected and informed these geographical anxieties through his writings, inspiring his readers to see the conquest of the air as a necessary and inevitable step in the march toward the Anthropocene, or what Williams calls human empire. Geographical ballooning enterprises also inscribed themselves within the broader phenomenon of the adventure. As Sylvain Venner explains, the adventurer became a respectable category only in the second half of the 19th century. A new kind of literature that began with authors influenced by Fenimore Cooper and reached its apex with Verne, and the proliferation of illustrated travel publications after the Franco-Prussian War were central in the ideological construction of a space for adventure and a valorization of knowledge acquired through personal experience rather than through study. The aforementioned Henri de la Vole was an exemplary specimen of this phenomenon. Born to an aristocratic family just before the Franco-Prussian War, he grew up with Verne novels that inspired a taste for adventure and developed a personality marked by the kind of virile panache that defined the ideal turn-of-the-century aeronaut. Fresh out of military service and heir to a large fortune, the young Lavaux decided to travel around the world, visiting India, Indochina, China, Japan, the Americas, and more. He followed those journeys with an ethnographic mission to Patagonia, where he collected material that would become part of the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle and the Musée du Trocadéro. Soon after his return in 1898, he was introduced to ballooning by way of tethered ascents in Paris. Lavaux became so enamored by the practice that he decided to abandon any further ethnographical aspirations. From 1898 to 1903, he made a total of 80 ascents, traveling more than 16,000 kilometers, spending more than 706 hours aloft, and carrying along 253 passengers. The most impressive of these ascents was the one he and Saint-Victor made during a balloon competition held at the Exposition Universelle. Departing from Vincennes, the two men flew for 36 hours before landing in Korostyshev, near Kiev. Even though Eastern Europe was not unknown territory, long-distance ascents suggested that France was at the vanguard of exploration and of bringing the rest of the world closer to Paris. As Lavaux wrote regarding his voyage to Korostyshev, quote, "Thanks to the balloon, the inaccessible vastness of continents has become a fiction." This sentiment, of course, applied to other regions, and the press followed Lavaux and Saint-Victor closely when in 1901 they attempted to cross the Mediterranean aboard a balloon. The Mediterranean acquired a more prominent position in the French imaginary at the turn of the century. For one, France's southern shores were developing a growing tourism industry. Just as important was the sea's geopolitical value. As France's colonial involvement in Africa intensified, people started to think about strategies for troop mobilization and rotation, something that acquired even more urgency following the 1898 Fashoda incident. The Mediterranean's prominence in the French geopolitical imagination was neatly expressed by a July 14, 1901 article the deputy dandy Bonny de Castellane published in L'Écho de Paris. In general terms, Castellane discussed the quote-unquote Mediterranean question, calling for a foreign policy that took into account France's weakness in the Eastern Mediterranean and its strength in the West. As Lavaux put it in a subsequent article presenting his idea to cross the sea, quote, "The Mediterranean is a French lake. Every day it becomes more strictly ours. It is therefore of interest to find ways to expand the channels of communication and of information of this great body of water by all possible means." Lavaux and Saint-Victor's first attempt to cross the Mediterranean aboard a balloon came only 3 months after Bonny's article was published, and it was financed through a subscription publicized by the same L'Écho de Paris. The money helped finance a giant hangar in Les Sablettes, an isthmus to the south of Toulon. 2 other men were also aboard the balloon, baptized the Mediterranean, when it departed. The engineer Henri Hervé, who designed the apparatus that would aid in steering the balloon, and the Navy Lieutenant Jean-Marie Tapissier, who was in charge of the military's Parc d'Aérostation in Toulon. But the press was more interested in the aristocrats, who through their activities in the Aéro Club had adopted the role of ballooning ambassadors. Le Petit Journal, for example, dispatched a reporter to Versailles to stay on top of reactions by Lavaux's parents to any incoming news. But once again, winds did not cooperate, and after 41.5 hours aloft and having made it close to Perpignan, the crew decided to bring the balloon down in the ocean to be rescued by a cruiser, and then docked in Toulon, where reporters anxiously waited to interview the adventurers. Even though Lavaux and Saint-Victor's attempt to cross the Mediterranean did not succeed, they and other aristocratic aeronauts self-fashioned themselves as stoic, manly heroes at the service of the nation. To borrow from Michael Adas's work on technology and imperialism, aristocratic aeronauts articulated the balloon as a measure of men, both at home and abroad. Ballooning was not only a practice in which to distinguish oneself from the masses, but also a symbol for the French civilizing mission. The aeronautical colonial imaginary started to consolidate in the late 19th century, but it will still be years before colonial aviation was effectively put into practice. Only after World War I, following the industrial advances that allowed the construction of more reliable airplanes, did the first air routes across Africa start to emerge. Through the work of Saint-Exupéry, Mermoz, and other pilots of the Ligne Aérienne Latécoère, which later came to be known as the myth-ridden Aéropostale, the route through the skies became an important component in the management of France's interwar empire. Saint-Exupéry's performance of his masculinity was also deeply informed by his aristocratic background and colonial adventures, thus revealing how tropes developed long before the advent of the airplane continued to inform aeronautical culture even after heavier-than-air machines substituted balloons as the reigning technology. Thank you.